D-Day in Europe wasn't the bloodiest fight of World War II. That title actually belongs to the Pacific. Okinawa wasn't just a battle. It was a nightmare that killed nearly a third of the island's people. And what's worse, the way Japan and America fought here directly shaped the decision to drop the atomic bomb. So if you think Europe was brutal, wait until you see how Okinawa redefined the word bloodbath. Chapter 1. The Battle Buildup. It's spring, 1945. Okinawa is only about 350 miles from Japan's southern tip and was marked as the Pacific's final stepping stone. Grabbing this island would give the U.S. massive airfields and anchorages within easy striking distance of Kyushu and beyond. So the U.S. 10th Army, with over 200,000 troops, 102,000 Army and 88,000 Marines plus support, assembled to seize Okinawa. The plan? Invade in force, build bases, and choke off Japan. Posing them on the ground was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army, with roughly 100,000 Japanese soldiers plus Okinawan conscripts. For months, the defenders worked like beavers. Instead of sitting on the beaches, they took advantage of Okinawa's coral ridges and caves, burrowing into tunnels and bunkers. Japanese engineers carved out a series of fortified lines across the southern end of the island. Their goal was simple: make the Americans pay in blood. As one U.S. historian notes, the Japanese knew outright victory was unlikely, but hoped to inflict such casualties that the Americans would hesitate before invading the homeland. In other words, turn Okinawa into a killing field big enough to change history. Before we move on to the next section, please don't forget to subscribe if you've liked the video so far. Chapter 2. Hell Unleashed. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, Operation Iceberg was at hand. The largest amphibious landing of the Pacific War. Hundreds of U.S. ships and planes erupted into fire. Battleships and aircraft carriers pounded Okinawa's defenses. In fact, on that very day, carrier planes sank the Japanese super battleship Yamato, the pride of the fleet, on its way to attack the invasion fleet. With the way cleared, over 180,000 U.S. soldiers and Marines stormed the beaches. Surprisingly, the first waves met little opposition. The Japanese had adopted a different tactic. Rather than die on the sand, they fell back into hidden caves and ridgelines. But the carnage was about to explode. The battle inland quickly became the bloodiest the Pacific had ever seen. The famous Hagura kamikaze pilots threw everything at the U.S. fleet. 36 Allied ships were sunk and another 368 damaged, with nearly 5,000 sailors killed. Nearly 40% of total U.S. casualties at Okinawa came from these suicide dives. On land, U.S. forces ran into web after web of pillboxes and machine guns. Hills like Sugarloaf and Kakazu Ridge became meat grinders, and the Shuri defensive line held the Americans at bay for weeks. By the end of June, both sides had been almost annihilated. But there was one major problem. Okinawa was not empty. Chapter 3. Moral Crisis. Okinawa had nearly 300,000 people living on it, many of them civilians. When the battle raged, the innocents were trapped in the crossfire. Nobody escaped the devastation. Estimates put the civilian death toll at an astounding 100,000 to 150,000 men, women, and children. In other words, roughly half of Okinawa's population died. For perspective, Reuters reports that up to 1/3 of the island's inhabitants were killed. Why such horrific losses? Japanese military propaganda had terrified Okinawans into believing the Americans would commit unspeakable atrocities. As one 25-year-old survivor, Sumiya Oshiro, later recalled, "We were told that if women were taken prisoner, we would be raped. We should not allow ourselves to be captured." Terrified families hid in caves or blew open their own doors with grenades rather than surrender. In some massacres, Japanese officers handed frightened civilians 2 grenades, one to throw at the enemy and one to use on themselves, as a veteran governor later described. The result was beyond comprehension. Thousands of Okinawan civilians committed mass suicide, and those who didn't were often slaughtered in their shelters. Some children even begged to be killed to end the horror they saw around them. The numbers are staggering. In 82 days of fighting, American forces took roughly 49,000 casualties in Okinawa, including about 12,520 killed or missing. That makes Okinawa the single costliest battle in the Pacific for U.S. troops. The Japanese military lost even more. An estimated 110,000 of Ushijima's soldiers were killed. Only about 7,000 surrendered. Okinawan civilian losses were catastrophic. Most historians cite somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 dead. Modern consensus usually centers near 100,000. To put it bluntly, nearly everyone on the island paid a terrible price. Chapter 4: The Key Battles. Amid the butchery, a few moments stand out as almost cinematic. On June 18th, U.S. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commanding the invasion, was killed by Japanese artillery while inspecting the front lines. Buckner, the son of a Confederate general, thus became the highest-ranking American officer killed in World War II. On the Japanese side, the last samurai moment came on June 22nd. Japanese Lieutenant General Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, General Cho Isamacho, committed ritual suicide in their command bunker rather than surrender. Ushijima's last words reportedly were, "If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the battle." A chilling reminder of how ferocious the fight had been. Not all the stories were grim. American courage also had a face. Army Medic Corporal Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon, became a legend on the Maeda Escarpment, Hacksaw Ridge. Under constant fire, he single-handedly carried 75 wounded men down the cliff to safety, a feat for which he earned the Medal of Honor. Doss's story, later made into the movie Hacksaw Ridge, encapsulates the heroism that can emerge even in the worst of battles. Want to understand the world better? Start with history and subscribe to our channel. Chapter 5: Okinawa's Oath. When it was over, the Allies held Okinawa. The island's airfields, like Kadena, became stepping stones to Japan, putting the American reach within blasting distance of the mainland. But the human cost was so chilling that it altered the endgame. U.S. President Harry Truman took note, seeing 12,000 Americans dead, plus the kamikaze slaughter, convinced him that a ground invasion of Japan would be far more horrific. In his words, Okinawa's high price in lives was a factor in approving the use of the atomic bomb to force Japan's surrender. For Okinawans, the war's scars remained. The island was occupied by the U.S. until 1972, and today hosts huge American bases. Kadena Air Base is still one of the largest air bases in Asia. Everywhere on Okinawa, reminders of 1945 linger. Craters, rusted tanks, even unexploded shells. Remains of the war still surface. Japan's health ministry reports that about 188,140 Japanese were killed on Okinawa. And while most of those remains were collected in a peace cemetery, around 1,400 remains found in recent decades are still in limbo, awaiting DNA identification. Local bone digger volunteers say about 2,800 of the war dead are still buried in caves and fields. Over the years, they have personally unearthed hundreds of skeletal remains from the mud. This grim work continues even today, a sign of how the battle's legacy isn't buried with its combatants. Decades on, Okinawa still asks tough questions. Japan's own records say roughly 200,000 people died on Okinawa, more than in Hiroshima, and about 50 to 60% of those were civilians. One Okinawan teenager put it simply in a poem: "My beloved island was reduced to an Isle of the Dead." That image, Okinawa was an island of the dead, haunts and will continue to haunt survivors and their families forever. What did we learn from this inferno? Strategically, Okinawa was a stepping stone to Tokyo. But as one historian bluntly titled his book, it was the blood and the bomb of the Pacific War. The hellish fighting convinced leaders to seek a swift end at any cost, and it foreshadowed the unimaginable that followed in August 1945. Above all, Okinawa became a stark lesson in war's extremes. In a clash of empires, the biggest toll fell on ordinary Okinawan civilians, students, and even children. Do you think the Battle of Okinawa justified the use of the atomic bomb? Or was it proof that both Japan and America had already gone too far? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Here's another video history buffs enjoyed watching. Goodbye for now.